This is one of the most significant cases that the justices have decided in recent years. Here, the Supreme Court ruling that President Trump's use of these emergency tariffs that he has implemented are illegal. It's the most significant economic case to reach the high court in years, sweeping implications for the economy and, of course, for presidential power. And at stake here are billions of dollars in revenue that have already been collected by the government. Pamela Wolf, the other significance here is that this is the first time that the 6-3 conservative court has ruled against President Trump in one of these major cases that have gone before the court since he returned to power in January. Now, we are still going through this case, but this is something we have been waiting for. The court said that it would take up this case on an expedited basis. So they're deciding, even though it's a significant case now, because of course this has enormous implications. So as we go through this opinion now with our team, another outstanding question is what now happens to all that revenue.
All right, guys, welcome back. Dr. John is here. So what just happened, guys? Trump is unraveling inside the White House, screaming at staffers, attacking judges, threatening the entire federal judiciary. The reason is simple. The DOJ he transformed into his personal legal weapon is being systematically destroyed in court, case after case collapsing.
That had been collected. This is something it really wasn't clear from the arguments what they would say about that, if they're going to lay out a plan. So we will continue to go through this, but this is an enormous decision and a rare loss for President Trump before this conservative court.
This is, Paula, a major slap at the President of the United States, who has made a major effort over these many, many months to impose all of these tariffs. And just to look at some of the background I have here, over these many months, the administration has collected $150 billion in these tariffs. So what happens to that money? Do they have to refund that money to the firms, to the people who paid for those tariffs?
Judges across the ideological spectrum rejecting his legal theories. He genuinely believed the courts would bend, that his appointments and intimidation would cause judges to step aside. Instead, he's discovering for the first time in his life that there are forces even he.
That's one of the big questions that came up at arguments, and it's something that we're looking through now in this opinion. The top line is that these are illegal, that the president cannot rely on this 1977 emergency law to impose tariffs without authorization from Congress, because this question is really about the extent of presidential power. And we know in both his terms in office, President Trump has really worked at the edges of what has largely been recognized as executive authority. But in these arguments back in November, they went on for 2.5 hours, it was clear that the justices were skeptical that President Trump could rely on this vague federal law to impose global tariffs. Now, they did appear to likely be willing to decide that these were illegal, but what is not clear, and we haven't gotten to this part of the opinion, is what happens to all that revenue that has been collected by the government. And President Trump has said himself that this is, this is a massive decision for him, so we're waiting for.
Cannot overpower with bluster. The Constitution is holding, and he cannot handle it. The latest catastrophe to rock the Trump legal empire revolves around his tariff scheme. This was supposed to be his signature move. The grand demonstration that he could reshape global trade with a single pen stroke. Trump attempted to invoke emergency powers to impose sweeping global tariffs, arguing that he possessed the unilateral authority to rewrite international economic policy without consulting Congress, without building consensus.
Reaction both from the Justice Department that argued this on his behalf and also from the White House. But we're going to keep going through this, Wolf, to try to see if the justices laid out any plan for what happens to that revenue.
All right, Paula, stand by. I know you're going to be reading all these the opinions and everything. I want to get back to you, but I want to bring in our senior legal analyst, Ellie Honig, right now. Ellie, as I said, this is a huge setback for the President of the United States, and this has been a traditionally conservative Supreme Court, but they ruled that all of these tariffs that Trump has imposed over these many months are illegal. It's a big deal.
Well, Wolf, it's a monumental ruling, and the bottom line is that the tariffs Donald Trump announced back in April on Liberation Day are gone. They have been ruled illegal by this U.S. Supreme Court. An interesting array of justices here. In the majority, ruling that the tariffs are illegal is Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Gorsuch and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, three conservatives who teamed up with the three liberal justices, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson,
without following any of the normal processes that have governed trade decisions for generations. He thought he could simply declare an emergency, sign an executive order, and watch the world adjust to his demands. The Supreme Court looked at this power grab and delivered a verdict that echoes through every corridor of government. They struck down the tariffs completely. They didn't modify them or suggest minor adjustments.
To rule these tariffs unconstitutional. The dissenters are Justices Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh. And the basis for the ruling is this. Congress, not the president, Congress typically holds the tariff power. Now, Congress passed this law back in 1977 called the International Economic Emergencies Act. And Donald Trump tried to use that law to say, well, I'm declaring an international economic emergency, therefore I'm imposing tariffs. But the majority here said, no, that law does not authorize you to impose tariffs. And no, there is not a valid international economic emergency here. So the end result, and we are still going through this, but the end result is that Donald Trump's tariffs have been struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. But really important point I want to make, Donald Trump has said, various White House officials have said, if he loses on this basis,
they didn't send the case back to lower courts for further review. They rejected Trump's entire legal theory as an abuse of emergency powers. The highest court in the land told the most powerful man in the country that he had overstepped his constitutional authority, and they did so in language that left no room for appeal or reinterpretation. Trump's response to this defeat was immediate, venomous, and genuinely frightening in its implications for democratic governance. He went on social media and began attacking the justices.
He will try to re-implement other tariffs through other laws, which he can try to do. However, those other laws are much more restrictive. They would not allow him to apply the type of sweeping, massive, across the globe tariffs that he tried to impose here, but have now been struck down. Look, Donald Trump said these tariffs are the single most important thing he has done in his presidency. He said that, and now they've been struck down by the court.
So you're right. The administration has made clear that if the court strikes this down, that they'll look at other tariff authorities to use. But bottom line here, Ellie, how big of a mess does this ruling create, given the fact that the administration says it has already received $150 billion in revenue, largely paid for by American businesses? Do they get a refund? What happens now?
Personally, he called them a disgrace to the nation. He labeled them cowards who lacked the courage to support his agenda. He accused them of disloyalty, as though Supreme Court justices owe personal allegiance to a president rather than to the Constitution they swore to uphold. The tone of his post suggested something far more dangerous than ordinary political frustration. He was attacking the legitimacy of the court itself, suggesting that any ruling against him must be the product of corruption or foreign influence.
Yeah, so it's hard to think of a case that has broader implications politically and legally and economically than this one. I know a lot of people are watching for this one. We don't yet have the answer. This was a question that came up during the oral argument. Amy Coney Barrett in particular asked the lawyers, well, what do we do with the $100+ billion that have already been paid by American importers, by American manufacturers? We're going to look carefully at this. I know Paul is reading this very carefully, but that's a huge question. Will there be some sort of mass refund program? Will the court rule that the tariffs are dead from here on out, but there are no repayments? We will let you know as soon as we get an answer to that one.
All right. As you noted, Paula has been reading through the opinion. I want to go back to Paula Reed because we know that 3 conservatives sided with the liberals on the court. And you have a quote from one of those conservatives, right, Paula?
That's right. Well, this is Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion where the court agreed 6-3 that President Trump's tariffs exceed his power under the law. He wrote, quote, "The president asserts the extraordinary power to unilaterally impose tariffs of unlimited amount, duration, and scope. In light of the breadth
or some hidden conspiracy rather than the straightforward application of law to facts. This is what authoritarians do when independent courts refuse to rubber stamp their decisions. They try to delegitimize the institution itself. They paint judges as political operatives. They lay the groundwork for ignoring future rulings or taking more drastic measures against the judiciary. Trump's outburst after the tariff decision wasn't just angry, it was ominous.
History and constitutional context of that asserted authority, he must identify clear congressional authorization to exercise it. And we knew that the Chief Justice would be a key vote after what we saw at arguments. Now, we are still going through this. I want to show you, this is about a third of the opinion. It's 170 pages long. This is just a fraction of it.
Wow.
So we're going through it very carefully to try to understand what, if anything, the court said about what happens to all that revenue the government has already collected. I know that's a big question right now. We are carefully going through this to see if they laid out a plan, if this goes back to the lower courts. That's what we're working to figure out right now.
And a quick question from me, Paula. Do the tariffs immediately go away as of right now, or does it take a few days or at least maybe a few weeks for them to be removed?
And that tariff loss represents merely one battlefield in a much larger war Trump is waging and losing against the judicial branch. Consider the case involving Jay Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve. Trump became convinced that Powell had committed some undefined crime, that the Fed chair's monetary policy decisions constituted prosecutable offenses.
Well, they've been declared by the Supreme Court to be illegal. So we're going through to see if they laid out some sort of plan. But as of right now, people should not have to pay a tariff today or tomorrow, one would think. But we're looking to see, because the logistics of this are so complicated, to see if the justices waded into that, or if all of that is going to be something that's now going to be tossed down to lower courts now that the justices have ruled on the larger constitutional question here, the separation sort of powers and who has the authority to do this, right? Because while this has enormous economic implications, really this was a question about the extent of executive power. We know President Trump really plays at the edges of that. And again, this is a rare loss for President Trump since he has returned to office before this conservative court. So we're going to keep waiting through what they said to work out the details.
He ordered the Department of Justice to bring charges. He demanded that his hand-picked legal team find evidence to support criminal prosecution against the nation's top central banker. The DOJ, whatever its current state of institutional decline, still employs career attorneys who understand the basic requirements of criminal law. They looked at the evidence Trump insisted must exist. They reviewed documents. They interviewed potential witnesses. They conducted the kind of investigation that actual prosecutions require. And what they found was absolutely nothing. There was zero evidence of criminal conduct. There was no basis for charges. There was nothing that could survive even the most cursory judicial review. So the Department of Justice had to do something that must have been physically painful for an organization now structured around serving Trump's personal interests. They had to tell a federal court on the record, in a formal filing, that they possessed zero evidence against Jay Powell. Zero. The word appears in legal documents that will exist forever in the public record. The Justice Department of the United States, under Donald Trump's leadership, admitted in court that an entire criminal case they had pursued was based on absolutely nothing. The case collapsed immediately. There was nowhere else for it to go. You cannot prosecute someone when your own lawyers admit under oath that no evidence exists to support the charges. Trump's reaction to this humiliation followed the pattern he's established throughout his career. Whenever reality fails to conform to his desires, he screamed about it. He blamed everyone within shouting distance. He said the judges who rejected his case were wrong, as though being wrong is a legal standard that courts apply. He said his own Justice Department was weak, as though the absence of evidence is a failure of will rather than a reflection of objective reality. He said the entire system was aligned against him, which at this point is less a paranoid observation than a desperate attempt to explain why his legal theories keep failing the moment they encounter actual judges applying actual law. But the simple truth, the truth Trump cannot bring himself to acknowledge and would never admit publicly, is that his cases are losing because they have no legal basis whatsoever. His cases are losing because courts still enforce the Constitution. His cases are losing because even federal judges appointed by Republican presidents, even conservative jurists who might be sympathetic to Republican policy goals, will not shred their judicial oaths to satisfy Trump's personal demands. This is the moment when Trump's entire legal strategy collapses under its own weight. This is when the realization crashes down upon him that he cannot use the courts as a weapon against his enemies. This is when the screaming really begins, because Trump is discovering that all the power he accumulated, all the loyalists he installed, all the norms he shattered, still cannot overcome one fundamental reality. Federal judges have lifetime tenure. They cannot be fired for ruling against him. They cannot be intimidated by social media posts. They took an oath to the Constitution, not to any president. And when the choice is between enforcing the law and pleasing pleasing Donald Trump, a growing number of judges across the country are choosing the law. When Trump first entered office this time around, he operated under a set of assumptions that now look catastrophically naive. He believed he could invoke emergency powers to impose global tariffs and that no court would dare interfere. He genuinely thought the judiciary would defer to executive authority on matters of national security and trade policy. But the courts did stop him. The Supreme Court did say no. They did declare that he was abusing emergency powers in ways the law simply does not permit. And Trump, faced with the limits of his own authority, reacted not with strategic recalculation, but with pure, unfiltered rage. He attacked the justices personally and by name. He questioned their integrity and their motives. He suggested that foreign actors were somehow influencing their decisions. He called them traitors in everything but the actual word. And the entire nation watched a sitting president attempt to publicly humiliate the Supreme Court because they told him he couldn't do whatever he wanted. This is the behavior of an authoritarian who has never learned to accept defeat. This is what happens when someone who believes they should have absolute power encounters an institution that exists specifically to limit absolute power. Trump cannot process the loss. He cannot accept that the Supreme Court, the ultimate authority on constitutional meaning, has the final say over the legality of his actions. In Trump's worldview, his desires should be sufficient. His election should have given him total control. The fact that a group of 9 justices in black robes can simply tell him no and that he must comply with their decision strikes at the core of everything he believes about himself and his relationship to power. The threats that followed are even more disturbing than the attacks. Trump began talking about fixing the courts. He mused about replacing judges who rule against him. He discussed retaliation against jurists who don't show proper deference to executive authority. These are not idle musings from a man blowing off steam. These are threats against the independence of the judiciary from a president who has already demonstrated his willingness to shatter democratic norms. When a sitting president talks about fixing courts that rule against him, he's not discussing minor procedural reforms. He's signaling his desire to transform the judiciary into an instrument of executive power, eliminating the very checks and balances that define democratic governance. This is what authoritarians do right before they consolidate power. They delegitimize courts, they threaten judges. They prepare the public for a system in which the law is whatever the leader says it is. The Powell case exposes another dimension of this collapsing legal strategy. Trump didn't just want to win a policy dispute with the Federal Reserve Chair. He wanted to prosecute him. He wanted to turn a disagreement over interest rates or monetary policy into a criminal matter. He wanted the full weight of federal law enforcement to come down on someone he viewed as a political opponent. This is banana republic behavior. This is the kind of thing that happens in countries where leaders use the justice system to imprison their rivals. And it failed spectacularly because even in a compromised Justice Department, the basic machinery of criminal prosecution still requires evidence. Career attorneys still exist who won't sign their names to charges they know are baseless. Judges still review filings and ask basic questions like, "What is your evidence for this claim?" When the answer turned out to be, "We have nothing," the case died exactly as it should have. Trump's response to this failure followed his established playbook with clockwork predictability. He blamed the Department of Justice for being weak. He blamed the judges for being wrong. He blamed Jay Powell for somehow causing his own non-prosecution. He blamed everyone in his orbit except the person actually responsible for pursuing baseless legal claims. But the truth sits there regardless of how much he screams. The case was terrible. The case had no foundation in law or fact. The case was always going to fail the moment it entered a courtroom where evidentiary standards apply. Trump wanted the DOJ to be his personal law firm, filing whatever claims he desired regardless of merit. The courts reminded him that American justice doesn't work that way. Not yet, not completely, not as long as judges still believe in their constitutional role. The broader retreat of the Department of Justice is now accelerating across multiple fronts. They tried to attack law firms that represented Trump's opponents, and judges blocked them. They tried to punish states that resisted federal policy, and courts ruled their actions unconstitutional. They tried to use executive power to prosecute Trump's enemies, and the judiciary judiciary systematically dismantled each attempt. The DOJ has been forced to back down repeatedly, to drop cases, to admit in court filings that their legal positions were wrong. This is what happens when you try to transform the Justice Department into a personal weapon. Eventually, you run into judges who will not go along with the corruption. Eventually, you encounter constitutional protections that prevent arbitrary exercises of power. Eventually, every case you file falls apart because it was never built on legal foundations in the first place. And Trump's reaction to all of this is the same. He screams, he attacks, he threatens, he tries to intimidate judges into ruling his way through sheer force of personality and the implicit menace of his social media following. But it isn't working. The courts remain independent. The judges keep enforcing the law. The Constitution keeps functioning as the framers intended. And Trump keeps discovering that there are limits to his power that no amount of rage can overcome. The deeper meaning of these courtroom defeats extends far beyond the individual cases. Trump's inability to control the judiciary represents a fundamental check on his authoritarian ambitions. He can fire cabinet secretaries. He can pressure members of Congress. He can dominate the news cycle with outrageous statements. But he cannot fire federal judges. He cannot intimidate them into submission. He cannot override their rulings except through the legitimate appellate process, which keeps telling him he's wrong. This is the structural genius of lifetime judicial appointments. The framers understood that presidents would sometimes try to consolidate power, would sometimes view themselves as above the law, would sometimes need to be told no by people who didn't depend on them for their jobs. The current judiciary, whatever its flaws and whatever its ideological composition, is performing exactly the function it was designed to perform. Trump's reaction to these losses also reveals something crucial about his political vulnerability. When he was winning, when courts were ruling in his favor, or his cases hadn't yet reached judgment, he praised the judiciary. He called judges brilliant and fair and objective. Now that he's losing, those same institutions are corrupt and cowardly and disloyal. The pattern is too obvious to miss. Trump's relationship with any institution is purely transactional. If it serves him, it's legitimate. If it restrains him, it's an enemy of the people. This transparent self-interest is something voters can understand. It's something they've seen before in other contexts. And in a democratic election, voters get to decide whether they want a leader who respects constitutional limits or one who attacks any institution that refuses to serve his personal interests. The political consequences of these courtroom defeats are already beginning to crystallize. Every case Trump loses reinforces a narrative that he is not the omnipotent strongman he claims to be. Every judge who rules against him demonstrates that his power has limits. Every DOJ retreat proves that his legal theories cannot survive scrutiny. Over time, this narrative of defeat and weakness undermines the core appeal of his political brand. He promised to be a winner who could bend the system to his will. The system keeps bending him back. His supporters may not follow every legal detail, but they can understand losing. They can understand failure. They can recognize when someone keeps promising victory and keeps delivering defeat. The institutional damage Trump is inflicting along the way should not be underestimated. Every time he attacks a judge personally, he erodes public confidence in the judiciary. Every time he calls a court decision illegitimate, he teaches his followers that legal rulings against their side need not be respected. Every time he threatens to fix the courts, he signals that judicial independence is merely a suggestion that can be ignored by a sufficiently determined executive. This is how democracies degrade over time, not through a single dramatic coup, but through the steady accumulation of attacks on institutions, each one seemingly survivable in isolation, each one collectively destroying the norms that make democratic governance possible. The coming election will take place against this backdrop of institutional conflict. Voters will enter polling places having watched a president spend years attacking judges, threatening courts, and demanding that the justice system serve his personal interests. They will have seen case after case collapse because it lacked any legal foundation. They will have witnessed the DOJ humiliated in court, forced to admit it had no evidence for politically motivated prosecutions. The question before those voters will be stark and unavoidable. Do we want to continue down this path where the president treats courts as obstacles to be destroyed? Or do we want to restore a system where the rule of law actually constrains executive power? The outcome of that question will determine not just who holds office, but whether the constitutional framework survives the stress test Trump has imposed upon it. The tariff case stands as the most visible symbol of Trump's failed legal strategy. He attempted something unprecedented, claiming emergency powers that would effectively eliminate Congress from trade policy. The Supreme Court, with justices appointed by presidents of both parties, looked at his claim and said no. They didn't split along predictable ideological lines. They didn't find creative ways to defer to executive authority. They enforced the Constitution's separation of powers and told the president he had gone too far. Trump's subsequent meltdown, calling the justices cowards and shames, reveals that he never really believed the court would rule against him. He thought his power would be sufficient. He thought the norms against attacking the judiciary would protect him from adverse rulings. He was wrong on both counts. The Powell case demonstrates that the DOJ's corruption under Trump has limits that even loyalists cannot cross. Trump wanted the Federal Reserve Chair prosecuted. His Justice Department tried to make it happen. But the basic requirement of having evidence, any evidence at all, proved insurmountable. You cannot convict someone of a crime you cannot name based on evidence you cannot find. The DOJ's admission that it had zero evidence represents one of the most humiliating moments in the history of the department. A criminal case against the nation's top central banker collapsed because the government's own lawyers had to confess there was nothing there. This is not competent governance. This is not even competent authoritarianism. This is a president ordering prosecutions based on personal grievance and discovering that the legal system still requires more than his say-so to destroy someone's life. The law firm attacks and state punishments that courts have struck down follow the same pattern. Trump identifies a target, orders the DOJ to attack, and watches as judges review the legal basis for the attack and find it wanting. The department retreats, issues face-saving statements about reviewing options, and quietly drops cases that should never have been filed. The cycle repeats with relentless regularity. Attack, judicial rejection, retreat. Attack, judicial rejection, retreat. Each iteration weakens the department's credibility. Each failure makes it harder to threaten future targets. Each loss in court builds precedent that protects the next potential victim. What makes this moment so significant is that Trump is visibly reaching the limits of his power. He has filled agencies with loyalists. He has fired anyone who disagreed with him. He has bent the executive branch to his will through intimidation and personnel changes. But the courts remain outside his control. Federal judges with lifetime tenure continue to apply the law as they understand it, not as Trump wishes it to be. This is the wall that even the most determined executive struggles to breach. Trump can scream about it. He can threaten to fix it, he can attack individual judges by name, but he cannot make the judiciary obey him. He cannot force judges to ignore their oaths. He cannot transform the third branch into another instrument of presidential power, at least not yet, at least not completely. The desperation this produces is dangerous precisely because desperation makes authoritarians unpredictable. A president who accepts institutional limits can be trusted to operate within them. A president who rages against those limits and searches for ways around them becomes a threat to the entire constitutional order. Trump's attacks on judges aren't just expressions of frustration. They're tests of how far he can go. They're probes to see whether the public will accept more direct assaults on judicial independence. If voters don't punish this behavior at the polls, the next steps will be more extreme. The threats will become more explicit. The attempts to circumvent court orders will become more brazen. This is how constitutional crises escalate, and we are watching the early stages in real time. The midterm elections represent the moment when voters can either reinforce these institutional limits or signal that they're willing to let them erode further. If voters reward Trump's attacks on the judiciary by keeping his allies in power, the message to future presidents will be clear. You can assault the courts without political consequence. You can threaten judges without losing elections. You can treat the rule of law as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a principle to be defended. If voters instead reject this behavior, if they vote to protect judicial independence and restore respect for constitutional limits, they will have performed one of the most important democratic functions imaginable. They will have drawn a line that future presidents will think twice before crossing. The story of Trump's courtroom defeats is ultimately a story about whether democracy can defend itself against internal threats. The courts are doing their part. Judges are enforcing the Constitution. The Supreme Court told Trump his tariff scheme was illegal. Lower courts keep striking down his DOJ's baseless prosecutions. The judiciary is functioning as designed, checking executive overreach and protecting individual rights. But courts cannot save democracy alone. They need voters who understand what's at stake. They need citizens who recognize that attacks on judges are attacks on democratic governance itself. They need elections that reward respect for constitutional limits and punish attempts to destroy them. The courts have done their job. The question now is whether voters will do theirs.